Laramie Plains, Wyoming Territory, August 1888. The sun was a hammer on a brass sky, beating the scent of sage and dust out of the baked earth. In that immense heat-shimmering emptiness, Peder Solheim was doing something profoundly strange. He wasn't building a cabin from pine logs or cutting sod from the prairie. He was, with the painstaking slowness of a watchmaker, dismantling a derelict railroad water tank. The colossal wooden cylinder, bleached silver by years of sun and ice, lay on its side like a fallen god of a forgotten industry. Around him, the tools of his former trade as a shipwright were laid out on canvas: adzes, caulking irons, mallets. His nearest neighbor, Cassius Waite, stopped his wagon on the rutted track that passed for a road. Waite was the settlement's premier builder, a man who had put up 24 square-hewn, notch-and-saddle cabins across the territory. He leaned on a wagon wheel, a look of pity mixed with contempt on his face. "Solheim," he called out, his voice dry as the grasshoppers whirring in the heat. "What in God's name are you doing? The railroad paid you to haul that scrap away, not build a life in it." Peder Solheim, a quiet Norwegian with pale eyes that seemed to hold the memory of winter, looked up from numbering a massive cypress stave with a piece of charcoal. "I am building my home, Mr. Waite." Waite let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A home? That's a barrel. A barrel is for pickles, not people. You're building a wooden coffin, is what you're doing. It's the single worst shape for a house a man could devise." He gestured to the vast, open plains. "The wind out here will find no corner to break on. It'll just wrap around and squeeze the life from you. And the cold? A circle has more skin for the winter to bite than a good solid square. It's simple figuring." He shook his head and climbed back onto his wagon. To the men who worked for him, he'd later call the Norwegian tank-mad Peder. The name and the mockery stuck. Everyone thought the man was crazy. What did this Norwegian shipwright, this man who understood the physics of hulls and barrels designed to withstand the crushing pressures of the North Atlantic, understand about thermodynamics and airflow that a generation of expert frontier builders had completely missed? Stick with me, and I promise you, the answer to that question will change how you look at a simple circle forever. If you want to uncover more lost secrets of frontier ingenuity, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Wyoming. Peder Solheim had come from Bergen, a city of ships and rain nestled between 7 mountains. He wasn't a farmer, he was a craftsman of wood. He had spent 20 years in the shipyards, his hands shaping the curved ribs and hulls of vessels meant to punch through green water and shrug off ice. He knew how to make wood bend to his will, how to make a seam so tight that not a drop of water or a whisper of air could pass. He understood pressure, tension, and the elegant efficiency of a curve. When the promise of steady work on the Union Pacific Railroad brought him, his wife Ragnhild, and their 2 young children Torbjörn and Sigrid, to the Wyoming Territory, he brought that knowledge with him. Their first winter, in 1887, was spent in a conventional cabin, one of Cassius Waite's own constructions. It was a sturdy, respectable structure of squared-off logs, with dovetailed corners and a stone fireplace. By the standards of the territory, it was a fine home. By the standards of a Wyoming winter, it was a torture chamber. Peder, a man accustomed to methodical observation, began to diagnose the failure. The problem wasn't the logs themselves. It was the design. It was a machine perfectly engineered for losing heat. He watched Ragnhild endlessly stuffing rags and moss into the chinking between the logs, a battle she lost every day. He lit a candle and held it near the floor. The flame bent sideways, a visible river of frigid air pouring in from some unseen gap. The water bucket, set just 10 feet from the roaring fire, would have a skin of ice on it by morning. His children, Torbjörn and Sigrid, slept in their coats, huddled under every blanket they owned. The warmth from the massive fireplace went straight up the chimney, creating a powerful draft that sucked cold air in from every crack and crevice in the structure. The large, flat walls were like frozen tombstones, radiating a penetrating cold that seemed to leach the heat from your very bones. Peder realized they weren't living in a heated box. They were living in a sieve, desperately trying to pour warmth into it faster than it could drain away. The conventional frontier cabin was a masterpiece of failure, a design born of eastern forests and milder climates, wholly unsuited for the brutal physics of a high plains winter. The primary enemy was convection. In the square room, the stove or fireplace heated the air, which rose to the high ceiling and pooled there. Useless. This created a vacuum effect, pulling in dense cold air from the floor level. The result was a house with a hot ceiling and frozen floors, the worst possible arrangement for human comfort. The corners of the room became dead zones, pockets of stagnant, frigid air that never moved and never warmed. People burned through cords of wood not to heat their homes, but to fight a losing battle against their home's own inefficient shape. Peder saw this failure everywhere. He saw it in the exhausted faces of his neighbors, in the constant plume of smoke from every chimney, smoke that represented wasted fuel and wasted labor. Roscoe Fenn, the local timber merchant, saw it too, but he saw it as profit. He sold the logs to build the drafty cabins, then sold the cords of firewood needed to heat them. To him, the system worked perfectly. When Peder tried to discuss the idea of airflow and thermal layering with Cassius weight, the builder had clapped him on the shoulder. "That's book talk, Solheim. We build 'em square because it's strong and simple. You just need a bigger fire." Peder knew a bigger fire was the wrong answer. A bigger fire just accelerated the convection, pulling in even more cold air. The problem wasn't the fire, it was the box. And so his eyes fell upon the derelict water tank near the siding, abandoned when the railroad rerouted a spur line. He saw not a piece of scrap, but a solution. A perfect, seamless, curved solution. He approached the Union Pacific foreman and bought the entire structure, all 50,000 gallons of it, for $15, the scrap value of its iron hoops. The work began in the brutal August heat. Peder and Ragnhild, working as a team, carefully loosened the massive iron bands. With block and tackle, they lowered each 20-foot stave of cypress and redwood to the ground. These weren't logs. They were precision-milled timbers, 3 inches thick, with tongue and groove edges. Each one was numbered with charcoal. The community watched the strange process with amusement. "He's unbuilding a barrel to build a worse one," Roscoe Fenn remarked to a customer at his timber yard. "He could have bought good straight pine from me for what that effort is costing him in sweat." Peder ignored them. He laid his foundation, not a rectangle of fieldstone, but a perfect circle, 30 feet in diameter. In the exact center of this circle, he began to build a massive, squat pillar of stone and clay mortar, a solid core that rose 4 feet from the ground. This was to be the heart of his home. Then, the staves went up. One by one, he raised them, fitting the tongue of one into the groove of the next, the curve of the wood creating a perfect, rising wall. Ragnhild helped from the inside, steadying the colossal timbers. It was slow, arduous work. Cassius Waite visited again, unable to resist the spectacle. "You see your folly now, Solheim? A straight wall supports itself. This thing, it wants to fall outward. Your roof will push it apart." "The hoops held 400,000 pounds of water," Peder said quietly, not looking up from his work. "They will hold a roof." He was referring to the thick iron bands he would later cinch around the structure, pulling the staves into a state of immense compression that made the wall a single, monolithic unit. He cut careful openings for a small door and 3 small round windows, framing them like a ship's portholes, ensuring the structural integrity of the staves was not compromised. Once the walls were up, he began the most crucial part, a process utterly foreign to frontier building. He took up his caulking irons and coils of oakum, a tarred fiber used in shipbuilding. With a specialized mallet, he drove the oakum deep into the hairline seams between each stave, inside and out. Then he sealed it all with hot pitch. The smell of tar and pine filled the air. Luella Pratt, the settlement school teacher, and a woman of considerable, if conventional learning, stopped by one afternoon. "Mr. Solheim," she said, her tone a mixture of curiosity and concern, "I must confess my ignorance. What is the purpose of this tar?" "It makes it tight, ma'am," Peder replied. "Watertight, airtight." "But surely chinking with mud and moss is sufficient?" she asked. Peder shook his head. "Mud cracks. Moss holds moisture. It freezes and expands. It is a temporary seal. This is permanent." He was creating not just a wall, but a hull, a vessel to sail through the winter. His wife, Ragnhild, had her own practical concerns. "It looks like a giant's cup, Peder," she said one evening, hands on her hips. "Where will I put the table? Nothing is square." He simply smiled and pointed to the floor plans he'd drawn in charcoal on a spare plank, showing how curved partitions would create gentle, flowing spaces inside. The final element was the roof. He built a low-pitched conical roof, like a cap, its rafters resting on the top of the staves and meeting at a central point, where he left an opening for his chimney. Before he shingled it, he cinched the great iron hoops around the structure, tightening them with massive turnbuckles until the wood groaned and settled, the seams disappearing into a single, solid surface. The cabin, the tank, was complete. It stood on the prairie, stark and strange, an object of widespread ridicule. But Peder Solheim knew something they didn't. He knew the physics. The mockery was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of geometry. Cassius Waite and the others believed a circle had more skin than a square of the same livable area. They were wrong. For any given area, a circle possesses the shortest possible perimeter. Peder's 30-foot diameter home had a floor area of roughly 707 square feet. A square cabin with the same floor area would need to be about 26.6 feet per side. The perimeter of Peder's circular wall was about 94 feet. The perimeter of the equivalent square cabin would be nearly 107 feet. That was 13 extra feet of wall length, 13 more feet of seams to leak heat, 13 more feet of surface to radiate warmth away into the wind. The circle wasn't the coldest shape. It was, mathematically, the most efficient thermal envelope. But the true genius was inside. The central stone hearth was the engine of the home. A typical fireplace set against an exterior wall wastes half its radiant heat warming the outside world. Peder's central hearth radiated its energy in all 360 degrees into the living space where it was needed. This created a perfect, continuous loop of air. Warm air rose from the central mass, traveled outwards towards the walls, and since there were no corners for it to get trapped in, it followed the gentle curve downwards. As it cooled and sank, it was drawn across the floor back towards the hearth, to be reheated and rise again. He had created a gentle, slow-moving thermal vortex, a living, breathing heating system with no moving parts. This constant circulation meant the floor was never icy cold. It meant the heat was distributed evenly throughout the entire volume of the house, not trapped uselessly at the ceiling. It eliminated drafts by replacing chaotic, leaky airflow with a single, closed, deliberate circuit. The hearth itself was a thermal battery. The 3 tons of stone and clay would absorb heat for hours while the fire was burning. Long after the flames died down to embers, the massive stone core would continue to radiate a steady, gentle warmth throughout the night. It was a concept modern engineers call thermal mass, and Peder had built a perfect example out of river stones and prairie clay. Combined with the ship-tight walls, which had an air exchange rate less than 1/10 of a standard log cabin, the system was brutally efficient. He wasn't just building a home, he was building a thermos. That November, the winter of 1888 arrived not as a season, but as an invading army. A series of blizzards rolled down from Canada, one after another, burying the plains under feet of snow. The temperature plummeted to 20, then 30 degrees below zero. The wind was a constant physical force, a scouring torrent of cold that found every weakness. It was the kind of winter that would be spoken of for generations. In Cassius Waite's own well-built cabin, the fight for survival was relentless. The wind rattled the window frames and screamed at the corners of the house. A fine powder of snow sifted in around the door. His family lived in a small circle around the stove, wrapped in blankets. The far corners of the main room were thick with frost. He was burning through his winter woodpile at a terrifying rate, nearly 1/4 of a cord a week. Roscoe Fenn, the timber merchant, was trapped in his own home, his yard buried in drifts, unable to make deliveries even if anyone could afford his prices. Families began burning fence posts, then furniture. Luella Pratt had to dismiss school indefinitely. The schoolhouse, with its large windows, was impossible to heat. She worried for her students, especially the younger ones in the more poorly built homesteads on the edge of the settlement. She heard stories of livestock freezing in their barns, of families staying in bed for days at a time just to cool their body heat. In Peder Solheim's round house, a different reality was unfolding. The wind howled outside, but it was a smooth, whistling sound. With no flat surfaces to slam against and no corners to pry open, the wind simply flowed around the structure. Inside, there was a profound quiet and a steady, even warmth. The central hearth glowed with a small, efficient fire of cottonwood. The temperature inside never dropped below 65 degrees. Ragnhild cooked their meals on a flat iron plate Peder had built into the top of the stone hearth. The children, Torbjörn and Sigrid, were not bundled in coats. They sat on the wooden floor, which was pleasantly warm to the touch, playing with carved wooden toys. Peder was using a single armload of wood a day. He had calculated his winter supply based on his experience in the square cabin. At this rate, he had enough wood for 3 winters. During a brief lull in the storms, when the wind finally paused and the sun shone weakly on a world of white, Cassius Waite decided he had to see. His own firewood was dwindling, and a grim fear had begun to settle in his heart. He bundled himself in every layer he owned and trudged through the deep snow towards the strange round structure on the prairie. He was expecting the worst, to find the family huddled and freezing, their foolish experiment a tragic failure. He knocked on the solid wooden door. Peder opened it. A wave of stable, dry, unbelievable warmth washed over Waite, a physical shock against the bitter cold on his face. He stepped inside and stopped, stunned into silence. He looked around the open circular space. There were no drafts. He could feel the warmth on his ankles, a sensation he hadn't felt in his own home in weeks. The air was fresh and clean, not stuffy and smoky. He saw Ragnhild knitting calmly in a chair. He saw the 2 children playing on the floor, their cheeks rosy and healthy. His eyes were drawn to the great stone pillar in the center of the room, glowing with heat. He walked over to it and placed a bare hand on the warm stones. He looked at the small, calmly burning fire, then back at the vast, comfortable space it was heating. All his years of experience, all his confidence in the right angles and traditions of his trade, collapsed in that single moment of sensory proof. He turned to Peder, his face a mask of awe and disbelief. "My God, Solheim," he said, his voice husky, "you didn't build a barrel? You built a furnace?" He asked Peder to explain it, not with defiance or superiority, but with the genuine curiosity of a craftsman who has just seen something that defies his understanding. Peder didn't gloat. He simply explained the physics as he understood them. The minimal perimeter of the circle, the continuous loop of air, the thermal battery of the stone. He spoke of it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Word of Waite's visit spread through the freezing settlement. Soon others came. Roscoe Fenn arrived, his usual bluster gone,